Hey everyone, thanks PJ. That's a really super generous introduction, and it really touches me right down here. I'm really glad to be here. For those folks who don't know me, I'm really glad to meet you, at least in this format. My name is in fact Kerri Miller, and what I want to talk to you about today is, well, mistakes. I want to talk a little bit about a few historical blunders, some modern head scratchers, and as a tradition, talk a little around the challenges and opportunities, but kind of from a sideways sort of direction. But I want to tell you mostly about just the stories of a few failures that I carry these stories around with me in the back of my head as I go about being an engineer. Now, I am, in fact, a senior backend engineer at GitLab. My team is the code review team, where you will be surprised and shocked to know we deal with everything that has to do with code reviews. In my spare time, I have a ton of hobbies. I am a yo-yo player, play musical instruments, a glass worker, and a motorcycle rider. I do a lot of long distance riding. This is the ride I'm going to do later this year, and I'm saying it in public so that I'm committed to doing it. I'm going to ride to touch all 48 contiguous states in 10 days. Believe it or not, this is actually the shortest route that you can take to accomplish this, and it might end in a total disaster. I might give up on day 4. Who knows? But I'm pretty sure that I can pull it off. Yeah, so I never thought that I was going to be a computer programmer, despite after-school classes, despite being privileged to grow up in a household where computers available to me 24/7. I actually thought I was going to be a stagehand or an actor. And when I started college, I actually pursued a performance production degree, which is lighting and set design, and I had a minor focus on puppets of all things. And I loved especially working like old Shakespearean plays. And one summer, I was fortunate enough to be a crew/cast member in a very small, low-budget company that was performing 3 different plays by Shakespeare at various venues around town. And I have a very particular memory of one night striding onto stage, and I proudly spoke the lines, "Gracious my lord, I should report that which I say I saw, but know not how to do it." And of course, the other actor stared at me, and clearly he'd forgotten his line to prompt me to continue. So no matter, I press on. As I did stand my watch upon the hill, I looked towards Burnham, and anon, methought, the wood began to move. Now, this is really critical information for Macbeth to hear, because there's a prophecy that that Burnham Wood is going to come, and that that's only when Burnham Wood marches on Dunsinane will his reign end. Except the problem was that I wasn't actually in Macbeth; I was actually in a production of Henry V, which is totally fine. These things happen, and most people really aren't paying real close attention to the words you say in Shakespeare anyway. So I could have covered. I could have said, "Oh my lord, thou carest not for that trifling news," and continued on. Except instead I said, "Oh shit." Well, you know what they say about it never being the crime but the cover-up? Well, that's one of the reasons why I actually collect stories about mistakes and disasters. And I really can't wait to hear the story about this one. Now, yesterday, PJ actually DM'd me on Twitter to ask how many pictures of this ship I was going to have. So here you go, PJ. It's really hard right now in 2021 to talk about disasters and mistakes without talking about 2020. And I don't really want to talk about that, except to tell you that what I did with my time this last year was I renewed my love of history. And I spent a lot of it reading about early Roman history, excuse me, the Bronze Age collapse in particular. And I got this weird idea I was going to go learn cuneiform, who knows why, what possessed me. So I started reading about ancient Sumer. And that's where I discovered the story of someone named Cusham. And I want to introduce you to him today. So I want to start telling you his story by talking first about this 3-inch square clay tablet. This tablet was made in 3100 BCE, and it recently sold at auction for $230,000. Now, it's engraved with a Sumerian pictographic script that predates even cuneiform, and it was discovered in an archive in southern Iraq, and it's one of 77 pictographic tablets that were found there. And due to the way that you actually make this script with a stylus, it actually has handwriting. So we know that these 77 tablets were all written by the same person. Who was that person? That person was Cusham. And Cusham has the distinction of being one of the first people in history whose name we actually know. And we know it because this is the symbol for his name. It consists of two pictograms. The lowercase I there on the left, it's the shape for ku, and that fuzzy vase, that's Shim. Now, historians are confident that this is in fact his name because it appears in 17 of these tablets, sometimes accompanied by another sign for Sangha, which we know to be a symbol for the title of a head priest or middle manager functionary at a temple. But what is he actually recording on this tablet? What's so important? Now, tablets don't always follow a top to bottom arrangement or left to right. So you're going to have to trust me and tilt your head to the side a little bit on this one. But there's three symbols here. The top one is the symbol for barley. The one in the middle is, if you look at it, it's a brick building with chimney. It's believed to be a brewery. And the bottom one is a conglomerate pictograph of barley and the symbol for exchange or trade. Now, on this tablet then, Cusham is tracking having received a shipment of barley at the brewery. The set of symbols over here is the time period involved, and it's actually in base 10. The large black dots are 10s, and little bowl shapes, those are 1s. So this indicates a time period of 37 months. Now, it's interesting to note here that the Sumerians actually used a 12-month lunar calendar, so every 3 years they had to have a leap month. So this is really just tracking the receipt of a certain amount of barley over the course of 3 full solar years. Now, how much barley is he tracking? This is a little bit trickier because Sumerians actually used a weird combination of base 6, base 10, and base 12 numeral systems. And the size of the mark matters. And I don't know, I'm sure it made sense to them. It's a little bit harder for us since we're trained for base 10 and we have zeros. But if you do the math here and you know their base unit is a vessel around 5 liters in volume, this tablet is recording around 135,000 liters of barley. And that's pretty precise. That's precise to within a gallon, basically, of barley. This is another tablet, also by Cusham. And this tablet is sort of a cheat sheet. The middle column outlines a series of equations that tell us the amount of barley and malt that you need for brewing different sized batches of beer. The upper left-hand corner, if we can get CamBot to zoom in, there we go. Here we basically have a multiplication table of serving sizes. Now, to read this again, large black dots are 10s. And we are also dealing here with Sumerian fractions. And fractions are written by grouping bowls together, and the number of bowls in a group being the denominator of the fraction. So for this row, we're multiplying 20 times 1/4. Those 4 little bowls clustered together is a quarter. And that results in 5. The elongated bowl is on its side is 5. I'm assuming that it makes sense and you're all nodding along at home. Here we have 1 dot, or 10 times 1/3 for 3 and 1/3. And here we have a sideways bowl, which is 5 times 1/2, which gives us 5. Now, when Cusham scribed this tablet, he accidentally put a 5 where he should have put a 10, a sideways bowl instead of a dot. And we know this is in fact a mistake because we have other copies of this same information on different tablets also written by Cusham, and those tablets do not share this error. So poor Cusham, he's the first person whose name we know. It's the first math mistake, and it's the first person to be identified via get blame. But that's not really that bad a typo, really, right? That's just a math mistake. For top 10 typos in history, though, have you ever heard of something called the Wicked Bible? Now, it's also called the Sinner's Bible, and it's an edition of the King James Bible that was put out in 1631. It was well received. They used a subscription model to sell books then, and it sold out, if you will, through its run. But there was one problem. In the 10 Commandments, they go, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt commit adultery. Now, King Charles I and the Archbishop of Canterbury were not amused. In fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury said that, I knew a time when great care was had about printing. He's quoted here as saying that back in his day, people cared about the details, not like the kids these days. The printers were found guilty by the Star Chamber, fined £300, and they lost their license to print books entirely. And nobody knows how many copies were printed, but they were destroyed as soon as they could be found once the error was discovered. Luckily for us, they didn't get them all, and there are 15 that are still known to exist. And in fact, if you have $100,000, you can go buy one right now. I found this listing 2 days ago on Aba Books. It's a great deal on shipping too, $3 for this. So the point of telling these sorts of stories is because we humans are storytellers, right? When we talk about mistakes, or for that matter, successes, it's part of human nature to see ourselves as the hero of the story. We interpret events where we might only be tangential guest stars as to be solely about us. We might have only been tagged in on an issue or added in Slack, and it was solved by the time we got around to responding. But we're certainly glad to take the credit. Of course, we inversely talk down our level of involvement when we're talking about mistakes. Either it's someone else's fault or, hey, I'm just an innocent bystander at the mercy of the code. And we all feel this pull. We're all human, just like Cushion. So we make mistakes. We're not the victims of software. We're the authors, though. We've invented math and writing to do things that our brains simply aren't very good at. And it's no wonder that for many people, math and logic and programming are difficult. To a greater or lesser degree, humans simply aren't wired for it. The engineers who wrote the software that plagues you today, they were humans, just like you and me. And we have to give them credit for the challenges that they faced if we want to talk honestly about their success and their failures. Software is essentially a compromise. It seeks to solve a human problem, and it's the end conclusion of an argument between being proactive and being pragmatic. Solutions offers only partial solutions to problems due to the different possibilities in which it will operate. Software will eventually fail us. So where do we find the resilience to continue towards finding solutions if everything's doomed to failure? We have to accept that we can't know everything. And then it's just a short step to begin to question how much we actually know at all, given that we can't quantify what the limits of knowledge about software are. It's a bit of a cliche to look back, wishing that we knew then what we know now. But it's really only in that retrospect that we see the value of the knowledge that we've gained. Several years ago, I gave a talk at Ruby or RailsConf asking people what they wish they'd known about programming before they started, so we could pass it along as like a top 5 list. But everyone came back and said, software is all about people, and that's what I wish I had known. And the more I thought about it, I realized that that's really true, because seldom will you ever be purely on your own. There's almost always a team of people contributing to the success of a project. Communicating intent and developing empathy to understand the perspective of others, it allows you to multiply the efforts of those around you. Developing the skill to work with other people in a constructive, positive manner in a way that brings out the best in those around you, there's almost nothing better to have a reputation for. And so learning to work with other people, communicating over email, learning to be a whole individual are valuable skills that employers look for. Ultimately, tech is in fact a team sport. But even as we multiply success of those around us, we also run the risk of compounding and multiplying the effect of small individual mistakes in ways we can never predict. That kind of collides in the story of Vasa in 1628. Now, it's a fairly famous engineering disaster, at least in engineering disaster circles. You may have heard of it before, but in a nutshell, Vasa was ordered built by the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, in 1624, 1625. And it was all part of Sweden flexing her military muscles against Poland and Lithuania. She was built by a private corporation using a mix of public employees and contractors, which is ahead of its time. It was lavishly decorated, and it really represented the ambitions of the king, both for himself and Sweden, and it was one of the most powerfully armed vessels in the world at the time it launched. The shipwright, Henrik Hybertson, had actually signed a contract for building 4 ships, and he had gone ahead and started construction using the very same designs he'd used on other ships in both Sweden and his native Holland. Engineering principles of shipbuilding hadn't really been worked out by then. There was no book of tables or ratios to look up. There was no real science to it. Ships were artisanal, bespoke, one-of-a-kind affairs. They were built by master craftsmen, more by eye and imitation of other ships than by anything we'd recognize in a modern assembly line-driven world. Variation between ships was really far more common, and it was considered to be a feature. And Master Henrik's features, he had such a reputation for building fine craft that were fast and sturdy. So he had enough juice then that when the king, who had lost 10 ships in a naval engagement, demanded even larger, more heavily armed ship, Master Henrik was able to push back and say no and continue on with his work. Except Master Henrik fell seriously ill in late 1625 and retired completely. He handed the entire project over to another Dutch shipwright who was also confusingly named Henrik. We'll call him Henrik the Younger. Henrik the Younger had no problem acceding to the king's suggestions. They couldn't actually make it longer, but he did agree to build it larger, patterning it on a different ship, a ship that had 2 gun decks so it could hold twice as many cannon, and to make it very tall and grand and bolt on literally tons of ornamentation and filigree to show off the power and wealth of Sweden. It finally launched on August 10th in 1628, and thousands turned up on the shore to watch the launch of the newest warship. The day was calm, the sky was blue, there was a very light breeze from the southwest, and the ship was hauled out to the edge of the harbor and raised sail and began to make its way east. They opened up the gun ports and they ran the guns out to fire a salute to the city as they left. But just then, a gust of wind fills its sails and she heels over to port to the left. So they quickly lower the sails and the ship slowly rights itself as the wind subsides. Great. They cast up the sails again and they're back off. Except now an even stronger gust of wind again forces the ship over onto its port side, this time pushing the open lower gun ports under the surface. This allowed water to rush into the lower gun deck, and the ship could not right itself fast enough. It was so tippy and weirdly heavy. And it took on water through these open gun ports at a furious rate, and it sank quickly barely a mile from where it left port. 30 sailors were unable to escape the furious inflow of water and lost their lives. They waited a few days, about a week, and then sent a message to the king. And it took about 2 weeks for the king to finally get the message because he was off in Poland fighting in his war. The king, as you might expect, was furious, and he demanded that somebody be held to account. Now, the captain was interrogated, as were the crew. They were rounded up and made sure that everybody was sober. A lot of focus was paid on those open gun ports, in whether or not the cannon were secured properly. Did the cannons all slide over to one side and tip the boat over? Lined up against the other side, though, were the shipbuilders and it was demanded of them, why did you build it so narrow and tall? A tall and narrow ship would be tippy and unable to right itself quickly. They knew that much. And in fact, this had actually been shown in early trials while the ship was still at dock. But no one was willing to tell the king that 2 years of effort and cost would have to be scrapped and started over, or the delivery of Vasa to the Navy would be delayed. Master Henrik the Younger, in fact, blamed old Master Henrik, swearing he was just following the old man's design. In fact, he'd been following from the king. Of course, we can't blame the king, right? I mean, the king had approved every blueprint, of course, and it was built to his spec, and it certainly wasn't overloaded. In the end, blame was placed on Henrik the Elder, who had passed away from that illness that had forced him to retire. It was a safe political ending to a disaster. The wreck was rediscovered in the 1950s and raised from the ocean floor in 1959, and modern shipbuilders were able to take very accurate measurements of it and build scale models, and discovered that it was, in fact, too tall, exactly as the test at the dock had shown. Vasa was simply too unstable to ever sail and was merely a disaster that looked like a ship. It seems kind of obvious a little bit, right? That this is the sort of situation that we would deal with. Changing specifications, a belief that design patterns are implementation patterns, and a toxic culture where honest communication about problems with the plan are ignored in favor of meeting arbitrary deadlines set by executives far away. Clearly, there's a reason why we talk about Vasa today. The trick, though, is that not everything is always a mistake. Sometimes disasters are just ideas that are too early or too radical or simply don't have enough obvious benefit in the moment to support their adoption. The guy who came before the king who built Vasa tried to get his people to adopt a base 8 system. Kodak, for decades, internally used a 13-month metric calendar. Both of those ideas have demonstrable advantages, but certainly not enough to convince a wider world that is invested in other solutions. So perhaps calling something a mistake or a disaster is simply less a matter of empirical truth and more a matter of perspective or interpretation. See, it's difficult to adopt new ideas, especially ones that are fundamental or orthogonal to our existing paradigms. Cushion and the Sumerians actually used a base 12 system for counting. And just as our base 10 system is likely to be counting on our fingers, Sumerians' base 12 system is suspected by anthropologists to have risen through a similar biomechanical origin, which is counting on their knuckles. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, both systems are perfectly functional, understandable, and intuitive to the cultures in which they arose. They operate on a human scale, so we're able to comprehend them. But if you throw out base 7, well, that's outside of our biomechanics. We don't have a natural connection to the number 7 in how we're constructed as creatures or how we operate with the world. Now, base 20, on the other hand, I can count that on my fingers and toes, but we're approaching the edge of short-term memory ability to hold ordered data together. See, it's flexible, of course, but there's a reason why we have top 5 lists. We have a limited amount of space in our mental buffer for identifying distinct individual ideas. Once we go beyond a certain number of items, and it's different from everybody, but 7 is usually what you find in literature. Once we go beyond this number, our brain shifts to a different form of working with the world around it. We count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then lots. We shift from discrete identification of items. We begin to see groupings of items. Now, obviously, we are able to make distinctions to different size lots. One group is more than 7, but less than 20, or it's more than 50 or 1,000. But our scale has changed. This is pretty fundamental to humans as a whole and to individuals to a greater or lesser degree, but it's one of the more important pieces of UX design when you're organizing information and architecture. There are other ideas around how humans operate in a fundamental or culturally appropriate manner that allow us to work with users rather than against them. And I'm sure that we've all come across user interfaces that are mind-bogglingly, overwhelmingly designed. That comes into play in the story of Revlon. Now, if for some reason you're not aware of Revlon, it's lipstick, eyeshadow, perfume. It's a makeup company. And a few years ago, they decided to buy a rival company. Now, in order to do this, they did a lot of complex financing deals, but the important thing to the story is that they borrowed a couple $1 billion and they hired Citibank to act as their loan servicing agent, sort of a fancy accountant to keep track of who they should pay. So every month, Revlon puts money into an account, and Citibank then disperses those funds out to the people that Revlon owes money to. Citibank doesn't own any of the debt. They're just a middleman. They're just an accountant. So early in 2020, Revlon found itself in a position that no company ever wants to be in, namely that its liquidity position was extremely tight. Revlon's in trouble, unfortunately. And there's only really 2 ways that the story is going to end for Revlon. They're either going to suddenly discover some groundbreaking new way to make a pile of cash in a hurry, or they're going to pay off their debts by selling the company piece by piece to their debtors, a debt for equity swap. If you don't pay your mortgage, the bank takes your house. So Revlon did what any company in this situation does, and it buys time by spinning out an ever increasingly complex debt restructuring deal to improve its situation. The details don't matter, but basically what they did was they said, we're going to pay the power company, but we're going to put off the cable bill. Now, this obviously pisses off the metaphorical cable company here, right? Lenders who weren't part of this deal now found themselves getting paid not their usual monthly millions and millions, but just like a pittance, a few million a month to pay off the interest instead of paying down the principal. And they're mad. They're fighting mad. They didn't agree to this. They are fighting in court mad. So imagine their surprise when only 20 hours before the threatened court deadline to begin the lawsuit, Citibank simply wired them the full balance of the money owed by Revlon, $900 million. Now, at first, they thought, apparently Revlon did have the money. I guess threatening to sue them worked. And we actually know this because we got their chat logs. That was short-lived, however, because a couple hours later, Citibank sent them a series of increasingly frantic emails saying, hey, that wire transfer, that was an intern, somebody heard it. And the lender said basically, finders keepers. So what the heck happened here? This happened. As the court decision in the eventual court case, because you knew this was going to go to court, right? The court decision used phrases like certain technical limitations and a very manual process to describe this screen. Basically, what they had to do this fancy pay some people but not other things, 3 and only 3 of these checkboxes had to be selected: principal, front, and fund. The bankers who were doing this failed to check one of those boxes. Now, they're not dummies after all, and Citibank actually has what they call a 6 eyes policy, where 3 people actually have to sign off on any transaction of this size. It looked fine to them. It looked like every other transaction they'd ever done. She'll ship it, click the button. The problem was that instead of $8 million being sent as an interest payment from the Revlon account to the lenders, $9 million was sent, which fully paid off the loans, and that $900 million came from the Citibank account. It took a couple hours then for the reality of the situation to dawn on Citibank that now, instead of being an agent, they're now the proud, if unplanned owners of $900 million of basically worthless debt. Citibank's now in the cosmetics business. It was a rough day at Citibank. in our industry, we talk about mistakes, and a lot of mistakes like this as opportunities to learn something new. That's the spin that we put on it. The example I always like to use is Play-Doh, because it was invented when a chemist was trying to invent a new kind of wallpaper cleaner. And you can post on Twitter later that, TIL, did you know that there was an original kind of wallpaper cleaner to even improve on? If we take something from these stories, and going all the way back to the story of Cusham at the start, perhaps it's that the moral of the story isn't that every culture eventually invents intoxicants, but that we exist at the opposite end of a very long line of mistakes, a continuous chain of errors, typos, and general failure. Failure is hard to avoid because hard stuff is hard. And not just because of the effort it takes, but because the risk of making a mistake, the cost of an error. I recently saw a thread on Twitter arguing against iterative development process, against Agile, in favor of a return to waterfall methods where we plan out as much of a project as we can before we start. And I really wish that I was as smart as that person so that I could be able to predict all the things that are possibly ever going to go wrong on a project, regardless of its size or its relative difficulty. Some failure points certainly are easy to predict, like things we've experienced before. If I've touched a hot stove in the past and got burned, I know now not to touch hot stoves, right? But I don't have to touch that stove necessarily. I can also watch you touch it. As a human, I can use my empathy to know now that touching a hot stove will get you burned. Of course, from there, we move beyond our direct experiences. We have to rely instead on our imagination. Now, if you've never touched one, and no one you know is dumb enough to touch a hot stove, but you have sort of a vague societal, social idea that touching a hot stove will get you burned, well, it makes sense because hot things are hot, and you can use your intuition, your imagination to know that you shouldn't touch hot stoves. But we're starting to tread into the category of it won't happen to me because I'm special. I'm not an idiot. I'm not going to touch a hot stove. And that's where it gets worse here. Things that are impossible, when there's no way that the stove could be hot because the hot surface light isn't on, or it isn't even plugged in, or I don't even think that stove has worked in years. And we see this in how many injuries and deaths are caused each year simply because somebody thinks that there's no way that the car is in gear. This is the realm of many of our most surprising failures, if not our most interesting. This is the bank shot, the never in a million years, the string of coincidences happening at just the right time to expose just the right series of flaws that should never actually break, where failures happen. Complex, ambitious systems, the sort that most working professional software engineers work on, attract these kinds of failures like ants to a picnic. There are failure modes that we completely ignore because they're entirely outside the realm of possibility for our industry, or so we assume. We only vaguely worry about fires and earthquakes, vindictive data center employees with axes, bad solder on motherboards, alligators in the office, and until recently, the need for everyone to suddenly work from home. The hardest to imagine, though, are the problems that we've never heard of, which is why stories of failure and disasters should be so compelling, and why, as an engineer, you should collect your own. So we started in Sumer with Cusham, but my first love in ancient history is ancient Rome. And we always think of Rome as this great city made of gleaming white marble and statues and everything. But the truth of the matter is that most of Rome during the empire would have been made of brick, red fired clay bricks. This is an example of a Roman apartment building. This is the Casa Giotto di Diana, which was built in the late 2nd century CE. It's still standing almost 2,000 years later. This is the Trajan market, built in the mid 1st century CE. Imperial Roman style of building here is called Opus Latericium. It literally means brickwork. I like to be fancy and say the little Latin that I know. And really, all this is bricks facing a core of that other amazing Roman invention, Opus Cementium, which is cement or concrete. 2,000 years later, and we haven't come up with anything better than cooked mud. They also used massive amounts of brick and tile for their hypercaust systems, their plumbing, their cooling systems. It was genius. With so much demand, brick and tile making was a huge industry in ancient Rome. The scale required to meet the demands of Rome, certainly during the Empire period, was massive. And that's where we start to see the beginnings of communal industry. Individual brick and tile makers were engaged in piecework. They were not paid for working at a factory, but for the number of lines of, the number of tiles or brick that they produced. Individual craftsmen would fire their work in these large communal kilns. They would mark their product with a maker's mark to mark what pieces were theirs. Now, usually it's just a symbol, but if you know letters, you might mark your name or the lot number or the client that you're working for, something like that. Later, more organized craftsmen or more prosperous craftsmen might have a stamp made to standardize the marking for their shop. Now, the sharp eye might actually notice that this is actually backwards. This isn't a mistake on my part. This is a mistake on the part of somebody in somewhere in ancient Rome. And this sort of thing happens far more often than you might expect. And the likeliest explanation we have here is that the person who made the stamp was literate, but didn't know that what they were making was going to be used as a stamp, so didn't think to reverse the name so it would be imprinted correctly, or that the tile maker couldn't read enough to realize it was reversed. And there's dozens of these examples in archaeology, and it seems like it is a mistake. But is it actually a mistake? Doesn't this mark the tile as belonging to this person just as much as if the name was in the quote unquote correct orientation? This isn't the only mistake that we find in tiles. We also get thousands of tiles with cat prints on them because in ancient Rome, cats were everywhere. I mean, that's what they used to keep mice and rats in check. And it wasn't just cats. We've got puppy prints all over. We've got prints of cats and dogs and sheep and goats, and even deer and pigs have been discovered. And of course, we also have humans. Fingerprints, footprints, shoe prints, boot prints, you name it. These markings on tiles and bricks from ancient Rome are so common, they're absolutely unremarkable to archaeologists. For the rest of us, it provides a real human connection to a breathing, living world from 2,000 years ago. It's an interesting story. It's been said that there are no new stories, only new characters and settings. Everything in our postmodern world is a reference to something else, and that's something that we can embrace. We may stand on the shoulders of giants, but that's not the end of our story. We're the inheritors of a technical tradition, but it doesn't end with us. We're just the temporary stewards of software as a tradition, as a grand endeavor to solve human-sized problems. Code is this living thing, right? And it's always changing and evolving. We can't grasp it in its entirety, and so our human mind personifies and anthropomorphizes it. Over time, each individual change that we pour sweat and care into, each bug that we patched, ceases to be distinct from the whole. The code just has always been this way. But every line, every call, every message is a choice that was made by someone with a complex and rich path that brought them to that moment, to that decision. But it's the nature of what we do that forces us to look not at software in its entirety, but the pixels, not that larger image that they resolve to. It tells a story, and our story defines us. When you know your story, your world can expand. Once you know what your story is, you can change it. So we're all just another link at the end of a very long chain of people screwing things up. And I'm okay with that. I hope that you can be too. I'm just like the links that came before me, and like all the links to come, I strive to be as strong as I can and not fail, but we all do when the conditions are right. The stories of failures of the immediate past bring some sense of relief because I can identify with them. I'm really glad I don't have to write Java the way that I used to write Java in the 90s. I can go even further back to the earliest days of software engineering, to the 60s and 70s, and see that the engineers then were struggling with the same exact problems that plague us today. That's where we get ideas like CAP theorem and object-orientedness, and the beginning inklings of complexity driving likelihood of failure. The giants whose shoulders we stand on struggled just as much as we do today. We humans relate to our world by telling stories about it, to ourselves and to each other. And with code, we have the tools to tell ourselves again the story of how it came to be. And we can look to stories about other code bases to tell us the story of our code. Our field, though, is still young, so we can look to even other stories in engineering and the wider human experience to understand how software can fail and how it can succeed. We use these stories to answer questions like, what does software do? How can it be better? And what does software long to become? And so I'm a big proponent and a cheerleader for having more storytellers in our industry, and honestly, less facts. We need more sonnets and poems and less dictionaries and thesauruses. We need to refuse to work and live only in pixels. We need to find a greater, better narrative for ourselves in our code to really find a story and code that's worth living. Thank you so much. I'm really glad I got to be here and talk to you all about Roman brickwork, which everyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I'm obsessed with lately. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kerri or everywhere. Again, I am a senior backend engineer at GitLab. Don't hold that against them. I'm also a motorcycle blogger, and generally I am a lackwit gadabout.
Kerri,
Thanks a lot,
thank
y'all.
you so much. I'm going to clap.